Hi, everyone. Welcome to Optimized for Humans. I'm Usha, an executive coach and consultant exploring the world of AI adoption and how to do it in a way that puts human dignity at the center. And today I'm really excited to be speaking with Alison Lands. Alison, welcome.
Lucia, thank you. Great to be here.
I would love to start, as I usually do, asking you tell us a little bit about your background and what is it about this topic that excites you?
Sure. Well, I'm an economist by training. Originally, I focused on urban economics, the economics of cities and regions. That really quickly became workforce development. So I was pulled into the world of talent development, labor economics, and the future of work quite early, right around the turn of the millennium. And there were disruptions then, just as there are today. But by and large, this has been such a rewarding career journey. I have worked with employers, I have worked with government agencies, I've worked with economic and workforce intermediaries, and education institutions. And these are all really necessary partners to our labor economy. They don't always act like they're partners in our labor economy. So I think there's so much meaningful work to be done there. And now that we are also layering on top of that some of the most historic disruption to our labor markets in at least our lifetimes, and certainly our working lifetimes, it's actually bringing a lot of those challenges to the forefront and introducing new and exciting challenges to work on. So I'm really excited to be here. Optimizing for humans specifically is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because ultimately, humanity and work's place in the human journey is so central to our identities, so central to our well-being, to how we derive meaning from our lived experience, that as we're entering the AI integrated and AI enabled era, I can see some of the challenges that that's presenting around the margins. It's giving, society a bit of anxiety. It's introducing a lot of skepticism or fear around, a societal and economic change. And to the extent that we can put humans at the center of this conversation and figure out how to use AI tools to unleash their potential and to help them derive even more meaning from the work that they do, that I think is our greatest challenge. It's the challenge of the moment, but it's also probably the challenge of our generation. So I'm excited to be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think it's the challenge of our generation. I mean, who knows? There'll probably be other ones that come, but for this moment, and what I love is that you really bring that economic lens as well as the organizational lens on this, because I think this is an important moment where we do need to be looking across, and this is an interesting moment of if we don't actually need humans to do a whole bunch of things that we've needed humans to do, what does that mean? But specifically in the organizational context, you're spending your time advising leaders on workforce development and what that means for now and the future. What are you seeing up close? What stands out?
Well, so working with enterprises, and primarily that has been
Hmm.
large scale enterprises. So, minimum 5,000, 10,000 employees or more. There is certainly a conversation to be had about the small and medium sized enterprise landscape because that is by and large the majority of employers and the majority of jobs in our economy. But when we look at these really large enterprises and think Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, there's an interesting dichotomy between the ones who are, looking towards AI enablement and AI adoption with a skills first mentality, and those that are looking at it from more of a automation, what can be automated, operational or financial cost containment perspective. My work has primarily been in talent development, in skills transformation. And so, by and large, the customers that come my way or the folks who engage me in these conversations are the ones who recognize the currency of the skills of their workforce and also see how that can be transformed, repurposed, how malleable it is, but also, they truly understand the leverage that humans and human capital bring to work. So, for the companies that, especially in my work with SkyHive, which was a skills intelligence platform that was acquired recently by Cornerstone on demand, for those who use that learning management system, one of the things that we saw was that, companies that sought to understand the skills they had in their people, the skills that the work of today demanded versus the work of the near term or long term future, the gap between those two things and how best to close that gap. this really differentiated those companies. And we're talking, about companies with global operations that are doing this, across geographic contexts as well as cultural contexts. And, for me, it's those companies that are really sort of, I think, thinking in a prescient way about what kind of intelligence they'll need about their people in order to bring them along for the AI enablement journey and also to effectively integrate AI into their operations. Many of those organizations use some kind of workforce intelligence. One of the interesting challenges that we're seeing is, a challenge around establishing and reinforcing trust in adoption of the AI journey. So you've got Asana, Rebecca Hines, formerly at Asana, now she is at Glean, is a PhD that works a lot in this space. She's done a lot of really interesting research about what the AI adoption journey looks like for the fast adopters, sort of your evangelists that are the AI superstars that have gone and
Yeah.
used AI before the company even sanctioned it. They're getting a lot of value out of it. They're creating these really powerful transformational spillover effects, not just for the people that they immediately work with, but actually across functions all over the company. So companies that are able to proactively identify who those AI evangelists are and to start to use them as change agents productively in the process, as opposed to blanket approaches to AI adoption or putting AI tools in people's hands and sort of letting them learn by experimentation. I think experimentation is really important, but we have to meet everybody in the workforce where they are. And we've got a multi-generational workforce, some of whom are digital natives, some of whom are not. Some are AI natives or becoming AI natives quickly in Gen Alpha, some not. And as we have that kind of texture in our workforce, there are varying degrees of trust, there are varying degrees of anxiety about using these tools, and there are varying degrees of skill and faculty with using these tools. And ultimately, it's not going to be one big, you know, blanket change across an enterprise. It's going to be an adoption curve and an adoption path. Companies that recognize how important understanding your skills and understanding your people are into bringing them along that journey, I think is really an area of differentiation that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so there's so much richness in what you're sharing. I think this changes a lot of things. I do think there's a whole number of skills that have now been unlocked that are still requiring humans to wield and use the AI to get to. I think there's a lot of narrative right now of like so much is ready to be automated in 10 years time. Who even knows like, whether we need humans in the loop, etc. I'm like cautiously optimistic about that. I think that's an okay future if we can figure out like the social systems around that. But I think like one of the things that stands out to me in what you're sharing is it's really important for companies to be having proactive conversations around where we need humans in the loop and what that partnership between humans and these AI skills actually looks like to get the outcomes that you ultimately need to get. And I think, it's a very nuanced and different conversation than the ones we've had before, right? If we, like, I'm curious what the data kind of shows about skills that have been important in the past versus now and what you're noticing in terms of how that's changing and evolving.
Absolutely. And I think, if we're thinking about what an AI adoption path looks like, yes, there are a lot of things that artificial intelligence could do. It doesn't necessarily mean that artificial intelligence should do it or that it
Yeah.
should be, a displaced or a completely automated skill with a human observation lens
Yeah.
versus a collaborative endeavor. I see a lot of
Yeah. Yeah.
companies at the moment thinking about what could we apply this technology to in our current state operations. AI
Hmm.
is going to invent altogether new work, and we don't even know what that looks like yet.
Exactly.
It will
Yeah.
transform industries. So,
Yeah.
solely focusing on scale, speed, doing legacy workflows faster or more may
Yeah.
actually be it may save you some money in the short term. It may actually be a short term kind of short-sighted focus
Yeah.
versus how do we actually enable our workforce with these tools and through them invent new types of work or invent new
Yeah.
markets or invent new
Totally.
products.
Yeah.
And there's a real risk in not understanding the skills of your workforce or moving too quickly for a cost containment or a cost optimization kind of a thesis where you may end up actually cutting some of the critical skills or institutional knowledge that would
Yeah.
otherwise have to transform and level up your business and create kind of a defensive or competitive moat in a future industry landscape that we yet can't envision. I think very like one of the closest corollaries I can think of is advanced manufacturing. Advanced manufacturing, especially during globalization and offshoring, like it lost a lot of capabilities from within the organization. And at the same time, some of the most experienced, seasoned, precision machinists who had spent their lives, problem solving more or less, like figuring out novel
Yeah.
ways to solve problems that arose on the shop floor and in the factory, um, retired, aged out of the profession. And it's only now that, for the past, 10, 15, 20 years, the manufacturing industry has been under a lot of pressure to try to figure out how to replicate the skills that come from an entire career of
Mm.
experimentation and tooling. It's not easy to do, even with AI. AI can assist it, but it can't necessarily generate net new insight in the ways that these human
Yeah.
workers could. So when I think about how that translates to the question of, what skills are relevant today versus what skills were relevant most recently, when I was working at Coursera, they still publish this report, but we publish a series of global skills reports where we're looking at the trending skills that learners are learning all over the globe, as well as what their employers are investing in. You can see, a rate of skills change, especially over the past 2 to 3 years, where, just immediately post pandemic, the top skills were consistently across the board: software development, cybersecurity, cloud computing, and data science and data analytics. Now, there is definitely still some of that flavor in the top skills that are being demanded and sought, but you're also seeing an increasing emphasis, and a constructive one, I think, on human and durable skills like, critical thinking, problem solving, various modes of communication: written, verbal, interpersonal, negotiation, judgment. And those, excuse me, are really important because if you are going to have a human in the loop, if you're going to have a human supervising a machine output or even collaborating with a machine, those are the things that machines at this point still have a very hard time replicating. I need to take a sip of seltzer. Apologize.
Go for it. Well, I think that's an interesting point of, I think we were the technical agents, right up until this point, and now we're switching into this new role of managing the technical agents. And those are very different skill sets, right, to operate in both directions.
Well, and the challenge with human and durable skills is that despite their evergreenness, despite their strategic importance, and that has been the case this entire time, as AI is taking on tasks, it's actually starting to strip away some of the less durable, less human elements and take on the responsibility for those, which kind of
Mhm.
exposes almost like the uniquely human skills and makes them, shines a spotlight on them, makes them ever more important. Those are also skills that while they're taught in school, they're not always taught in school in a formal
Yeah.
way. And so it's expected that you'll pick them up through socialization or through life experience or through applied, in the flow of work kind of a learning. To me, I think that actually sort of formalizes the importance of mentorship, of
Yeah.
applied learning, like on the job through the work. At Coursera, we had quite a lot of demand for human skills courses, but just taking an online asynchronous course on using good judgment doesn't enable you necessarily to use good judgment. The test
Yeah.
comes when you have a situation where you need to apply good judgment and you do it and you get a feedback loop from whatever decision you made and the consequence of that decision. And so I think we, regardless of what we decide to delegate to AI or to retain for, human performance of work, like we really have to keep, if we expect durable and human skills, to be a currency that we want to leverage, we're going to have to really intentionally invest in them. And sometimes that's not going to look like the most efficient outcome from an economic perspective.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about talent for a second in that vein, because, talent development and talent pipelines, that's something, especially in these enterprise large organizations, that's something that's like been done deliberately for a long time, right? Of you intentionally seek out, grads into these specific roles that are meant to mentor foster and cultivate their talent over time and put them in those situations where they can start to problem solve, etc. And now we're also noticing that those jobs are the easiest ones to automate. They're the easiest ones to, so you're actually like really affecting the entire pipeline on some level. What are you noticing about that? And what are you noticing about how leaders are feeling the tension of that?
As a person with a big chunk of my career squarely in the management consulting world, I was, I was on high alert very early on about this. As a person is kind of stepping into the consulting model, you do need to spend a couple of years just learning the craft of consulting. And a
Yeah.
lot of this is done through, I guess, what in an AI paradigm would be considered, like throwaway work or work that,
Yeah.
could be done in seconds by an AI. But if you don't go through that learning curve in that process, ultimately, um, how do you get your next generation of managers, leaders, and partners? Like they are needing to learn by doing. So, is it worth having a deck produced in 10 seconds if it potentially jeopardizes the durable and human skills of our next tier of senior managers and partners who are going to build the business? I think there's a value case, one for perhaps focusing some of these skills earlier in the education journey so that they're done inside of the wrapper or the container of formal K-12 and post-secondary education. And I think there's also a value case for bringing early career hires along, uh, so that they have the space to conduct interviews, make bad decks, like draw conclusions and hypotheses and get feedback from, mentors that have been, with the firm for years, so that they're learning both the cultural elements of the work as well as the craft of the work. One of the ideas that has sort of surfaced recently in my conversations has been about, the next generation of students coming up through K-12 and post-secondary will be truly AI native individuals. So that is a new type of worker. I think you and I, Usha, we may fall into the category of digital natives, or those who maybe sort of straddled the
Yeah.
analog digital, transom. But it'll really be the skills and the insights of this next generation of talent that end
Mhm.
up creating these new forms of work that the current incumbent workforce maybe has a hard time seeing because we're rather
Yeah.
anchored to the workflows that we're familiar with, that we have built our careers on. And I
Yeah.
think for brands to be able to reach further down into the education pipeline, we've always talked about doing it under the lens of career discovery, or trying to help young people think about what future careers and future education pathways would look like for them. I think there's also an argument now that brands can reach more deeply into the talent pipeline earlier so that they can actually harness some of the emerging, burgeoning insights of an AI native population that is probably thinking about the world very differently than
Yeah.
the current incumbent leadership.
Yeah, and I really feel for leaders in this space because they are navigating the tension of the push from the boards to cut costs and be more efficient, and at the same time, like needing to build more enduring organizations. And I mean, I think my advice as part of this would be to really leverage that kind of AI native skill set that these young people coming into the workforce actually have. Like, I don't think we need to, I think where we're getting stuck is this old model of like, well, they usually did the roles where like the analyst made the deck. That was the analyst's job. And now the AI can do that in 5 minutes. Great. What else could the analyst do? What is the combination of the analyst with the AI? What does that render? And so I think part of this is just like reimagining what's possible and also giving them some remit. I've heard some really great stories from other leaders I've had conversations with of hiring young people in particular, like recent grads, and actually giving them this remit of like, go look in the organization and figure out where we can be more efficient, where we can automate things, play with the AI, come up with some solutions. And they've had like really incredible results with that. So there's something about, I think, valuing the skill sets that they are coming in with that we might not even be able to like grasp or fully understand, that I think is going to be really meaningful. And it's, again, I'm always looking for like both and solutions, right? I think we're putting profit versus people, but I think the best solution is where you're able to do both at the same time. And this is, I think, an important place to be focusing on that.
And it is, I would say it is not, it should never be, um, an either or kind of a conversation. If it is, then we're getting ourselves into like a troublesome space, especially with the speed that AI can move.
Yeah,
The probabilities that we make a misstep and either act in kind of a short-term solutioning or a penny wise pound foolish mode are pretty high. And by the time we
yeah,
would realize it, we would be too far down the path and it would be actually a pretty costly thing to remediate and to try to rebuild something, as opposed to moving maybe a little bit more cautiously and intentionally,
yeah,
even though the technology is saying move fast. We can move
yeah,
fast, but move fast, you also break things. And there are certain things,
yeah,
especially in our workforce or in our labor economy, that once broken or scarred take generations to heal. And I think we don't want to do that. You brought up a really interesting point, which is that, you know, young people being brought in and given the space to question, experiment,
yeah,
try to, put forth ideas that may or may not land. That is one uniquely human skill that,
yeah,
generative AI can make, but there is a uniquely intrinsic desire to make and create that people possess. And that's not
yeah,
going away just because the tool could do it for you, right?
yeah,
So I do think there's a need to kind of give people a bit of psychological safety to have this experimentation. The
yeah,
costs or the risks feel really high right now because we're in a dynamic moment economically, politically, socially.
totally.
It feels like the cost of failure is quite high. And yet, this technology actually opens up a lot of space to take, a scenario based forecasting, show me five different versions of what the future could look like and let me game this out type of a mentality. And I think that is another kind of durable skill that we've got to cultivate is this ability
Yeah,
to sit with ambiguity, to try to
yeah.
take a look at things and how they could play out differently, and to figure out what is our comfort point with each of those. Like, how would we exist, in any of those different realities?
Yeah, and I think we all gravitate, like everyone loves mentoring someone young, right? Because they have a different sense of possibility than those of us who just like been around longer and we have all of these grooves that we have to kind of unlearn and unlock ourselves from. And I think that is both, I think there's an interesting tension there where on the one hand, I think that is such a gift in this moment where they have this technology and they have fewer reference points, which means they can possibly go places that you and I couldn't even imagine. And then on the flip side of that, I think they also lack a lot of context. And so there is a question, I think, to that point about like people learning through 10 years of problem solving, of being in these situations that are high pressure, high stress, and navigating using judgment in those scenarios and coming out of it. So there's also this piece, I think, of like for us to really think about like how do we make sure they're getting they have the freedom to experiment and like really unleash themselves, and also how are we making sure they understand the context they're operating in and the boundaries that do also exist as real. And again, these are like really, I don't think they're clean answers of like, here, go do this, here's the new role for all grads coming in. This is
Yeah.
something that I think every leader needs to figure out and work out, not just with young people. We're kind of putting a spotlight on that at the moment from a talent perspective, but I think this is about the reskilling overall, right? There's now a bit of question of like we are now doing something completely different. Like we now have different capabilities available to us. What does that mean in terms of how this team invests its time and energy and attention? And how do we do that in a deliberate way where we're experimenting, but in a way that's safe at the same time?
Yes. And, we know there's empirical research about how different workers using AI are perceived by their employers. So I think there's also
Mm,
this need. Um, I can't recall the name of the article, but there's an AI tax that is borne more heavily by certain populations of workers versus others in terms of whether it is perceived to be an innovative endeavor, like how proactive and creative you're being with the AI, versus you're using AI as a crutch. And that is a spectrum, and
interesting.
different workers perceive it and experience it differently. And so I think there's also a need, like from an ethics, from a responsibility perspective, to bringing the entire workforce along and doing it in a way where we get really cognizant about the extent to which, you know, certain categories of worker. That could be frontline workers, that could be different populations of workers within the workforce, how they're experiencing the AI transition and whether or not they are being rewarded or potentially questioned for how they use AI, and how we can tune that so we get a more consistent result. And so that, one of the unique things that I think is kind of interesting about this is when it's working at its best, what I'm seeing is internal experimentation where an aha by one person who has figured out a way, a colleague shared with me the other day. One of the ways, this is a person who's in a revenue commercial role, said, I programmed an agent to scan all of the, newsletters and email blasts that come in from all of our, ecosystem partners. I don't have time to read all of these, but I have it synthesize it for me and prepare me a little short reading list, but also give me a rundown of who are the top 5 organizations that we don't currently partner with that I should be reaching out to right now for partnerships about. And then what are the value prop for each of us to have that conversation. I'm like, ooh, that's brilliant. I was like, because so much of partnerships work is about finding who would be a good
Yeah.
partner and then making sure that there's value on both sides of it. Sharing that kind of a use case got everyone really excited. So then, we don't have to recreate that wheel. We now have a great example of how to use it. And through that example, we learn other ways to use it. And ultimately, it's creating value for us, for the potential partners that we partner with, for the
Yeah.
organization that we work for. When you
Yeah.
have those kind of win-win-wins, then I think it is culture building and it is generative, as opposed to something where there are winners and losers, and some people are very reticent or skeptical to use it, while others are charging ahead and
Mhm.
potentially creating a really unique situation where certain workers they won't be one person. They'll be one
Yeah.
person plus 10 agents. You're actually,
Yeah.
if they were to leave your organization, that would be the
Right.
absence of almost 5 human.
11 people.
That's
Yeah.
right. And that's a whole other conversation that I think, employers and talent leaders are probably starting to think about or catch wind of, that is going to
Yeah.
become the next conversation we have will be about the agentic workforce and the agentic worker and
Yeah.
what that changes about what we know about traditional HR and talent practice.
Yeah, there's two interesting points there that I want to pick up on. One is that piece around like the agentic worker, because I think previously it was tools, right? So even if a person left, the next person coming in uses the same tool. But like I can tell you with my own like AI systems and whatnot, they're so bespoke to me and how I work and my preferences. If I left, someone can't just like plug in and get the same result, you know? They may have some inspiration, but not necessarily, it's not a plug and play thing in the same way. So I think
Hmm.
that's a really interesting thing for us to be thinking about from an institutional knowledge perspective. And then I loved that point actually about different demographics having different perceptions around the use of AI. Like on the one hand, I hear stories of like companies, especially in tech, I think this is becoming very common. There's leaderboards of who's using the most tokens. And the idea being the person using the most tokens is somehow outperforming those who are not necessarily using as many tokens. And then on the other hand, you have people who are like using ChatGPT to write an email is cheating. So it's quite a spectrum. And I think within that is also fear that people have, both of using too much or not using it enough, depending on how they're navigating the people around them and the context around them. So I think that's a really interesting thing to be thinking about, and for leaders to be thinking about, what is the culture you want to set? And I really want to temper this by saying, I don't think we should have leaderboards about who's using the most tokens, because you can so
Tokenism.
gamify that. You can gamify that. I'm going to have it like crawl the web to give me news. That's going to use up tons of tokens, but it's not in service of the business, you know. I think we have to come back to like impact and outcome, not how many AI tokens are you using. And also on the flip side, for the people who say, you know, it's cheating to use it to write an email, my brain is not always the best to be put to use to write an email necessarily. You know, like I love not having to use my brain for certain things. And I think we need to be, it's more about being discerning about where do we put our attention and energy now.
Yeah, I think there's I also will reject the idea of tokenism around token usage. Like
Yeah.
that's a vanity metric. That's probably is leading to both positive outcomes and negative outcomes
Yeah,
in your
exactly.
business. But
The
just given that
choice.
range and that spectrum of attitudes about it, I feel like, you know, companies, we're at a moment where all of those realities exist within the walls of any organization, kind of small or large. You probably have all of those attitudes present.
Hmm.
Um, One is about meeting people where they are and and setting an endpoint of where you'd like the business to get to, and then
Yeah,
using AI enablement and adoption and skills acceleration as a mechanism to help evolve your culture and evolve your business while
yeah,
bringing people along on the journey in a way that's, equitable. Like everyone's going to get to the finish line. We don't all have to get there the same way, and we don't all have to cross it at the same moment, but we do
yeah,
all need to get to the finish line together
yeah,
in some way, shape, or form, thinking about skills as, skills as the new pension, skills as the new 401k, like investing in your
yeah,
people, figuring out what investment they need and making that
yeah,
investment to help them get to the future of work for your business and for every other employer that they're going to work with thereafter, I think is a really constructive way to think about L&D,
yeah,
talent development, HR practice, etc. And then,
yeah,
ultimately, how do you take those influencers who, maybe don't think of themselves as culture carriers, but in an AI world, they will be your culture carriers. And you want to use their positive experience with AI to help build trust within the workforce, to develop new use cases, to evolve the business, and ultimately, to reward those who are not using all the tokens, but are using them in
yeah,
ways that are really creative and get
yeah,
everyone excited about the possibility of the future. And then lastly, I'll say, I couldn't not say this from an economic development perspective, but there's been a lot of very recent articles this week, thinking about AI displacement, job
yeah,
eradication. Any big technology transformation has that inherent inside of it, but this is an area where collective action is really going to become important. For
yeah,
individual firms to only think about what's happening in the walls of an individual firm is going to end up becoming a risk more than it's going to become a strategic advantage. And
yeah,
economic and government and workforce developers really need to lean in, stay close to employers, and employers need to be somewhat transparent with those other parties about
yeah,
what they're doing and how the industries are evolving so that
yeah,
if and when workers are displaced, it's being done in a conscientious way with
yeah,
handoffs to the systems that exist to help those workers reposition elsewhere.
yeah. I think that, I mean, again, there's been some big news this week in particular. I think that's been very thought provoking for me. And there's two things as part of that. I think I really like what you're saying about like we need the governments and the companies to stay really close and also to take mutual responsibility for this. I think
Mhm.
like one of the pieces of news was OpenAI's letter around policy recommendations, and nowhere in there is like the business's responsibility. Like a 4-day work week could be a policy recommendation from government. It can also just be a choice you make as an organization
Mhm.
to take on efficiency gains, you know. So I think we need to be like careful about when we're consuming this news about just tempering the intentions that might be behind some of this. Even though, again, I'm a huge fan of the 4-day work week, I'd like to say that, but that's a business choice as well. Like you can do that now. You don't have to wait for a government to sanction that. Go ahead.
Similarly, similarly, I saw an economic development newsletter where the argument was we've always measured the big incentives, the tax incentives that communities offer to employers to locate in their region. We've always measured these by job creation. We're
Mhm.
investing so that when you come to this community, you're
Yeah.
creating good jobs for the people who live here. You're helping us grow our tax base. Well, at
Right.
this very moment, a lot of those incentives are going to data centers and
Right.
projects that don't employ a lot of people. And so the argument was we need to take a more expansive view of economic development. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that.
Yeah.
But if you're incenting a data center to come into your community, you need to make sure you're doing that with a knowledge of what the costs and benefits to the community will be. And then if
Yeah.
you are going to pay for job creation, those jobs need to be really high quality jobs and they need to have staying power. And so,
Yeah.
like, agree with that, but you're right. There are business decisions and there is a shared accountability across parties, that I think right now we're not hammering hard enough. but that may become, I hope we don't get to a place where we have to have the conversation because we've let it go too far and now we're experiencing societal pain and economic pain about.
Yeah.
I want to get to that proactively, that conversation, so that there's a shared prosperity in this
Yeah.
technology that's transforming our world.
Yeah, and I mean, along those lines, I do appreciate what OpenAI put out in terms of the policy recommendations and starting that conversation. I also think, too, though, like this is my bias. And again, this is my bias in this moment. It can change. But I think like the human AI partnership has like real exponential potential. And I think the technology is still, there's a lot of risk baked into it from a security and privacy standpoint, from a just like hallucination, like it makes mistakes, it's not accountable in the same way that humans are accountable. And I think we're kind of glossing over all of that because we're being promised, often by the companies that are creating this technology, that it's going to be able to be baked into every function and part of society and we don't need to work anymore and how great. But I mean, again, bias for now. We'll see what happens. But I think also for organizations to secure your own foundations from a security perspective, from a customer service perspective, like bring the partnership together rather than trying to optimize for one over the other.
Agreed. Yep.
Alison, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you. It's such a pleasure to speak with someone who really holds both the economic lens on this as well as the organization lens on this. I really hope that leaders think more critically about this. What's in closing, I'd love to just ask, like, what's one practical piece of advice you would share for a leader who's listening in as a first step?
Yeah, I think, as a first step, really thinking about things through, the lens of your team, your own skills acumen, the skills of your workforce, those who report to you, thinking about AI doesn't need to automate or replace everything. In fact, there's probably a spectrum of collaboration, partnership, displacement, and automation that needs to happen. Thinking about that just with yourself and your own immediate team can be really illustrative in terms
Yeah,
of the changes that are afoot right now, how you think your own business will evolve, and how you want to deploy those tools inside of your team in order to, affect that future or actually start to take, put yourself and your team in the driver's seat of it, as
mm,
opposed to maybe having to be a fast follower to someone else's innovation or even be,
yeah,
voluntold on how you'll do it from an operational perspective. I founded an organization called New Collar Skills. We work with organizations, across different sectors around these very topics. The term new collar skills was coined by Ginny Rometty at IBM about 10 years ago. And it was originally coined, to kind of evangelize to the federal government the need to close digital skills gaps. I'll argue that this term is more relevant than ever because blue
yeah,
collar and white collar skills are losing their meaning in an AI integrated future. We're all going to have to adopt that posture of
yeah.
agility and that mindset of openness to like what our future of work will look like and how we can shape it, as opposed to kind of sitting back and maybe trying to figure out the best defensive mechanism for when it happens.
Yeah, that feels more timely than ever. Thank you so much again, Allison. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Usha. Be well.